Coming up on Booked on Rock, as a fan of the band, man, am I happy to have this author on the podcast, Stephen Lewis. He's written a brand new book, the first official biography on the late, great Richard Manuel. We talk about his musical brilliance, the high times, the low times. We celebrate his life. We'll come to terms with his tragic early death. All that coming up next. Welcome back to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich, another great author on the show, author Stephen Lewis. This is his first time appearance on the show. He has written the new book, Richard Manuel, His Life and Music from the Hawks and Bob Dylan to the Band. It is due out June 17th. You can pre-order now through schifferbooks.com. We'll get into all the details after we talk about the book. So great to have you on, Stephen. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
The first official biography of Richard Manuel, that's correct?
Yes, there's been some projects that happened in the past. Unfortunately, none of them came to fruition, according to, people that I talked to. So once this got rolling, it was pretty easy to get the support of the family just because of it's been needed, and they realized that, and they were just amazing and thankfully gave me their approval to do this, and I'm glad how it turned out.
Yeah, you were watching The Last Waltz, and the idea came about, why not write a book on Richard Manuel?
Yeah, it's weird. A bunch of things kind of happened to make this work. First off, as I said in the book, I was watching The Last Waltz, and anyone who's seen that, one of the greatest, obviously, rock films ever. But when I first saw it, Richard struck me just this aura about this guy. And because I am what I refer to as a rock geek, I wanted to go deep. I ended up doing a deep dive. Now, fast forward a few years later, I'd written some pieces on Richard, had some people reach out via my website and be like, this guy needs a bigger story. So I saw the Robbie Robertson film, I think it was in 2019, Once We're Brothers.
Right.
And the same thing occurred to me. I'm like, I want more Richard. I started then and kind of slowly but surely started collecting information in a meaningful way. There were stories that existed, and then I tried to kind of tie them together with new information, new interviews, and stories that had never been told. And really, it became a biography, but also a musical analysis and kind of celebration.
And there were challenges along the way. 4 years it took to write the book.
Yeah, and I mean, admittedly, and unfortunately, a lot of people that I would have liked to talk to weren't around. And actually, we lost some people during the process of the book. But the people that were available and wanted to speak on Richard, it was just a testament to his enduring personality and the effect he had on people musically and as a human being, because everybody was just so willing to offer what they knew, what they loved about Richard, whether it be photographs, stories, music. And really, in that sense, like any biography, but it was a true collaborative experience. I was just blown away by how I was right about his effect on people, because everyone wanted to talk about him.
Which is what's so tragic about it, because so many people loved him, but yet he seemed to be so hard on himself.
And that's exactly it. I tried to bring out the more good, because we all know what happened, and I wanted to change the end of the book, when I got to the end, honestly, I was like, this has to end differently, it has to end there. And it didn't, but there's a lot of good in there. And I feel like, my end goal in this thing was to have a reassessment of his music and kind of highlight his contributions musically. And then the biography kind of went around the music and then informed each other.
Yeah. So thankful that, his full story is being told, because so often we're remembered by how our life ends, at least in these situations when somebody's life ends tragically. It's like that's the only thing people think about, and there's so much more.
You're exactly right. And that was what again, you can't change obviously what happened, but that's what really The Last Waltz, with the limited exposure Richard had as far as interviews and things like that. When you think about Richard Manuel, you're like The Last Waltz, which admittedly by his own admission, he was not in the greatest of shape. And then his tragic demise, and those things you can't, like I told some of his family members, that's the elephant in the room. You have to talk about it. But I wanted the focus to be on the music and his just natural ability to be an ensemble player and to create and write melodic music. I really wanted that to come to the forefront.
And the family provided you with some great photos, amazing photos of his childhood. So let's start there now. Let's talk about his background. When and where is he born? Where does he grow up? What's his life like?
Richard was born in Stratford, Ontario, Canada. He had three brothers, two loving parents, a normal kid. Music hit him at church, which, as you probably know, a lot of guys, the gospel influence, a lot of musicians, the harmonies, that all it hit a lot of these guys through church or through school music, and they got, and Richard, it was singing harmonies in church, and that's what got him. Typical kid though, Hellraiser, had a paper route, and then got bit by the bug for music. And it was in that time period, and that was one of the things that really intrigued me about Richard's story is he got on the rock and roll bus right along with everybody else. The thing that was different, and I tried to draw attention to this through the book, is Richard's affinity for the blues at such a young age. And I've said this to some other folks. The US wasn't kind to their blues musicians. They didn't know what they had at that time. Late 50s, early 60s, they didn't really know until the British blues boom, until these other guys started playing this blues music. And it really fascinated me. Richard, at 17 years old in Canada, picking up on these tunes and becoming, to sing the blues, you have to be authentic. And it's kind of crazy that he gained this authenticity just by repetition, immersion, and practice and the love of the form. And, that was something that I didn't hear myself in any of these stories. You hear the Ray Charles comparison, which is obvious, but then you look into Bobby Bland, James Brown, Jimmy Reed, like you can hear them all in Richard, especially in those early Hawks recordings.
Yeah, he was self-taught. That's the thing. He listened to radio a lot, WLAC.
Yes,
He
exactly.
had an elaborate way of capturing that late night signal, and gets that signal, and he's listening to rhythm and blues, and he's not just listening, but he's studying the styles of, like you said, Bobby Bland, Ray Charles, and Ricky Nelson. Mostly self-taught, right?
Yes, he had a couple lessons, and I talked to someone who was the son of one of his piano teacher, and it was like it's kind of like school for him, and school wasn't fun for any kid, especially Richard. And it's like he got what he needed from it, and then he took it to another place. He didn't need the confines of rules and regulations. He wanted to make his own path. So he got the basics, and then all that other stuff came, like you said, from 7-inch records and WLAC.
Yeah, and then you said he comes along at just the right time. He's born in what, 1940? What was the year he was born?
3.
43.
Yep.
And there is that explosion of rock and roll, and that takes over. And now he's super serious about being a musician full time. So let's get into his time with the Hawks. Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks. Interesting, he's from Arkansas, but gets a huge following in Canada. And then Richard lands on Ronnie's radar early on, but and this is another aspect of Richard as a person. He was so loyal to family and friends. Getting him to leave his band to join Ronnie's band, that took some doing.
And that kind of is a theme that you can trace through his entire career. That was another thing that I discovered, to go a little off your question, is Richard worked best in a collaborative environment, like a nurturing environment, creativity. And you can kind of trace that from Stratford in Kenny Kelmusky's basement to the basement in Big Pink. I mean, all the way down the line, he was an honorable guy and loved his friends. So to your point, he made a promise with the Revels drummer Jimmy Winkler and said, if we ever leave this band, the Revels, we're going together. And Ronnie, he kept pushing, and he saw Richard, the story that was in Levon Helm's biography, he saw Richard do Georgia at the Stratford Fairgrounds, when that was it. He's like, this guy, Ronnie was a collector of talent, and he was like, there's the guy I need to get. But to your point, he was honorable and cared so deeply about his friends, that he wasn't a guy to break trust.
Even if he knows it's an opportunity that could benefit his career.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the story, that you're like, man, because being the only guy that didn't have a solo record in the band, you're like, how is this possible for such a great songwriter, for such a great performer, singer, multi-instrumentalist? It's just, that's one of the things I couldn't definitively answer, but I think he needed and was begging for collaborator right till the end, honestly.
And what ultimately leads him to deciding, okay, I'll leave the Rebels and I'll join Ronnie? It was his bandmate that told him.
Yeah, Jimmy Winkler told him, he's like, you got to do this. You have to do this. And to preface that, they had all gone down to Arkansas from Stratford. If you can imagine, a bunch of guys piling in a car from age 16 to 19, 18, piling their gear, going down to Ronnie's club, and they kind of sharpened their tools down there and played in front of heavy crowds that were begging for blues music. They ran the gamut. It was absolutely crazy. And when they came back to Stratford, was it late 61, and Ronnie made that offer, they all knew what Richard had, and they encouraged it. And it took some pushing, family, friends, and the band. But as a testament to that band that he was in, the Revels, as you probably know, both John Till and Kenny Kalmusky ended up with pretty good musical careers out of
Yeah,
that.
everybody's career turned out just fine. So it worked out. So he's with the Hawks for a couple years or two, maybe 3 years, I think it was. Basically, Richard and the Hawks, they all leave the nest that was Ronnie Hawkins' band in 1964. What led to that?
Things started to separate a little bit with these guys because Ronnie had things a certain way. Now, what I have to say is Ronnie was very responsible for how these guys turned out later.
The work
He
ethic that he instilled. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, the discipline. But it got to be a point where Ronnie famously said, it's like the stuff that these guys were playing got too far out for me. They wanted to play gut bucket blues, and our guys and club owners wanted us to play, the twist. Like they had certain things and they needed to make money. So it got to the point where Ronnie had family, Ronnie had things he had to do. The Hawks felt that they had something and they could do it on their own. They finally decided to do that, and they kind of operated in this nebulous space for a while where they were doing what they wanted to do, but they weren't really making any money. And living conditions were hard. And they wondered, all of them at one point, if they had made the right decision. And there you
We
go.
should know, too. I mean, these are all the guys that make up eventually the band,
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So
Yep.
that's Lee Vaughn, it's Robbie Robertson, it's the Professor, Garth,
Garrett. Yep.
and then they end up becoming Bob Dylan's band. So another important name we have to mention is John Hammond Jr. Talk
Yes.
about his importance in terms of what would lead to the band.
Well, the funny thing is so after, and they were playing everywhere.
Sorry, Rick Danko too. I got to
Oh,
admit,
yes.
oh my God, Rick Danko,
Rick
what a
is,
voice!
oh,
Another,
he could have his own book. You know what I
yes,
mean? All these guys, and make that clear, they're all so deserving, and that's what made them. Allude back to what I said a bit ago. Ronnie was this great collector of talent, and took the best guys from every band he saw, which is just crazy. And
yeah.
then he made this monster.
First time
And
I ever heard it makes no difference. I thought, my God, this is the greatest voice I've ever heard. And then you hear the other guys, you hear Richard sing, you're like, my God, that's the greatest voice I have.
then you hear Levon sing,
it's
and
an
you're like,
it's just an amazing collection of talent. Sorry, anyway, we'll get to the band a little bit more,
oh yeah, but
but
that's you wonder why they were so fantastic, and you hit it right
but
on the head.
but yeah, how do they end up? Bob Dylan becomes part of the story now. John
Yeah.
Hammond
So
Jr.
John Hammond had been playing somewhere. I believe it was the Purple Onion. I believe somewhere in Toronto, and one of his, as one of the best blues purists ever. Hammond's doing his show, and somebody comes in and is like, "These guys, Levon and the Hawks, you guys, you got to check these guys out." And they connected, and John was like, they are authentic. They are real. These guys aren't playing around. And in the turn of the 50s into the 60s, before the Beatles came, mainstream pop music got a little sanitized. It wasn't the rock, that came in the late 50s. Things were, when Elvis came back from the army, it started to go, but things were just kind of mushy, I guess, for lack of a better term. And these guys were not. They were anything but. And Robbie was writing songs. Richard was writing songs at this point. That's something that's never really talked about is, there wasn't just one songwriter in the band at this point. Richard had been writing songs since he was 16 years old. And so Hammond saw these guys, and in particular Richard, he's like, this guy knew the blues. He's like, I knew blues players. This guy was one of them. The Hammond connection, it gets kind of fluid, Hammond knew Dylan, and there's a lot of myth and a lot of mystery and a lot of what, but Hammond told me straight up, he's like, I would have taken these guys as my electric band. If I was going to do an electric, I was thinking electric blues, and I was like, who else would play with me but the Hawks? That actually came to fruition on his So Many Roads LP, John Hammond's 1964 record. Garth and Robbie play on it. Rick and Richard do not. And it's not, John said it wasn't by his choice. It was just who was in the sessions at that point, and things of that nature. But he wanted them as his group. Through connections, again, the Canadian connection, Mary Martin, who worked for Albert Grossman, saw the Hawks in Toronto and was a great fan of them. And Dylan wanted to go electric, post Newport. He had played with the Butterfield Blues Band and then was getting ready to put together a full electric band. Mary Martin was like, you got to check these guys out. You got to check these guys out. To the point where like even Dylan was like, okay, like I get it. He ended up getting Robbie and Levon because all he needed was a drummer and guitar player after his electric debut at Newport. They did 2 shows, Forest Hills and the Hollywood Bowl. Absolute chaos by all accounts. People going nuts, people booing, people cheering, whatever it was. And Dylan asked Robbie and Levon to join his group full time, and both of them, in both of their respective memoirs, said, "You got to take us all. You got to take us all. We're a package deal here." And the thinking is, we already backed a guy. We already backed Ronnie Hawkins. We're not going to back another guy. We've got our own thing going. And Richard was all about it. These guys weren't folkies, but Richard was completely on board. And Dylan ended up going up to Toronto. And after a show, I believe it was at the Friars Club, after they had played their multiple sets late into the night, they got together and started to try to build this music that Dylan had in his mind, and the Hawks were the perfect fit for.
Wow. And you write, quote, musically, Richard's playing had advanced to another level while on tour with Dylan. There's a section in the book on the 1966 Bob Dylan electric sets. It's a basic makeup of the electric sets that Dylan and the Hawks played every night on that tour. And you highlight Richard's musical moments. Share your thoughts on those highlights. Like a Rolling Stone seemed to really stand out.
Yeah, and see, one of the things, and as we talked about at the beginning with these narratives that have created, when just to backtrack a little bit, Richard replaced a pretty good piano player in the Hawks, and there was a narrative that created that Richard, per his own description, was a rhythm piano player. And once I started to deep dive into these Hawks recordings, and then with Dylan, you can trace this ascent of him not just being a rhythm player, but being a melodic inventor. I mean, he's moving into these songs that aren't electric songs and that were written by somebody else and just sliding into the ensemble. And you can hear adding all of these flourishes and these touches. And Garth Hudson is a huge part of Richard's ascent as well in his playing. Who else besides, I believe, the Rascals had a dual keyboard attack?
Yeah.
Nobody had one like the Hawks. And I think it added a uniqueness to their approach. And obviously Dylan loved it. But to your point, these sets, like a Rolling Stone, that was a single and it was put out and people would boo the entire night. And then like a Rolling Stone, and a lot of these crowds would be like, oh, we know this one. This is great. And the Hawks and Dylan would use it as like kind of like a not so nice send off.
Yeah.
The angrier the crowd, the more aggressive they would play. But that the piano lick that kicks that off that Al Cooper played in the studio, I mean, it's like Richard slid in, hits the lines, it hits the improv, they would stretch it out at the end, and it's like he'd been playing these songs his entire life. All those guys. I mean, it's almost so revolutionary, those 66 shows, that even today, pick a night and it's like, it's fresh, it's combative, it's aggressive, it's everything you want rock music to be. And Richard was a vital, vital part of that.
Stephen Lewis is the author of the new book, Richard Manuel, His Life in Music, From the Hawks and Bob Dylan to the Band, due out June 17th. So let's get to the origins of the band. And for this, we zero in on a 3-bedroom home on 2188 Stoll Road in West Saugerties, New York. I've never been. A friend of mine has been there. I'm assuming. Have you been?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. It's just, it's nondescript. It's not because we know what it is now, but otherwise it's just, it's just a house there. And
That's exactly it. It
You
just
know,
happened to tap into that magic in the Catskills, that
yeah.
creative magic.
What led the guys there, and then how does that lead to the brilliant debut album from the band, music from the Big Pink?
So much was going on at this point. Levon left the Hawks because he couldn't deal with the combative crowds, the booing, the traveling. Just it wasn't for him. So he had left, and the Hawks continued on with a different drummer through this Dylan European stomp in the spring of '66. And after the tour, they all went to New York. They kind of woodshedded a little bit. Barry Feinstein, famous rock photographer, had a workshop there. He let the Hawks move in and kind of start recording. And Richard recorded Beautiful Thing, the first documented original for the Hawks of the band that we have available to us. And him and Rick recorded that in Barry Feinstein's photo studio. So they took the opportunity to start seeing where they were going to go. And then Dylan had his motorcycle accident, famously, and basically the Hawks were on retainer. And Albert Grossman, management, is like, well, what are we going to do here? If Bob's laid up, like what's going to happen? So what Dylan started to do was they filmed the '66 tour, unreleased movie, Eat the Document came of that. And they started to do cut-ins and some like surreal, weird stuff up in Woodstock. Robbie went up to meet with Bob, and then he called Rick and Richard, who were still in New York. The guys have been traveling around to see the friends and family back in Canada, whatever. And he's like, Robbie's like, you guys should come up here and see what we're getting into. So Rick went up, found Big Pink. Richard followed, and they got into doing this kind of surreal. There's a few pictures in the book of them, Bob in a coonskin cap, and they're playing in some weird room, but they were all doing like these cut-ins and just stuff for the film. And then, sure enough, they're musicians, they're not filmmakers. So Bob started showing up at Big Pink every day. And what was the natural thing that would happen? They'd start creating music. Bob had a certain kind of vision. He wanted to teach these guys, the Hawks came from an R&B, blues, rock background. Bob wanted to teach them about the traditional stuff that he had been raised on, but it was copacetic. Both of them were encouraging, and that's the thing. Everyone's like, Bob did this for the band. He did, but the band did this for Bob as well. It was the perfect mixture. And I always point to, and this may be crazy, but I point to John Wesley Harding and Nashville Skyline. That's a different Bob Dylan singing. Do you know
Oh
what I
God,
mean?
yeah, Nashville Skyline for sure.
It's like
The
sitting in a
crooner voice.
basement. Exactly. You're sitting in a basement with Rick Danko and Richard Manuel doing these basement harmonies, and it's like they both rubbed off
They
on
influenced each other.
totally. And I mean, Bob wrote with Rick and Richard, which was a rarity in those days. And Dylan didn't use backing vocals either. And that's what's so cool about those basement tapes. Free flowing and the beautiful harmonies and them bouncing back and forth. Sometimes it's humorous, sometimes it's beautiful, but it's always musical.
Man,
And
I'm thinking about Nashville Skyline now because I've always wondered what influenced that change in vocal style. Maybe that's what it was. Hearing Richard and
well,
hearing
yeah,
Rick and
I
those
agree with
beautiful high falsetto voices.
you. Yeah, and John Wesley, right before it,
You're right, John Wesley Harding. Yeah, that
smoothness in his voice. It's just I think he made a little more effort hearing these guys, like osmosis. In Richard's case, the songwriting. You're sitting with the greatest songwriter, arguably, of our times. That's got to rub off, even the construction. Because again, Richard was all about melody, not so much words. He could write words, but that wasn't his strength. His strength was melody. And I feel like, that combination of Dylan and Richard working together, which birthed Tears of Rage, which is
that's the
another,
one I want to ask you about. Yeah, the
yeah,
opening track. They wrote
yeah,
that together. Bob and
yeah.
Richard wrote. Okay.
They had a typewriter on the table, and Bob would come in, walk in to Big Pink in the morning, make his famous high test coffee. Guys would be slow to rise, people would be, getting up, coming down, and Bob would just be banging away. And one of these days, Richard was at the piano playing that Regal set of changes, and Bob handed him the lyrics and said, can you work with this? And Richard, in an interview with the Woodstock Times, was like, you don't ask Bob Dylan, like, what does this mean? So I just put music with it. Robbie, in his memoir, said, I felt that was when Richard's writing ability took the next step, and also when like we took the next step. And obviously they felt strongly about that to put it as the opening track of the record.
Here's what you write. Tears of Rage is one of the finest moments of Catskill Mountain sustenance to result from the big pink melting pot of influences. In addition to singing lead vocals on and composing Tears of Rage and We Can Talk, he sang lead on Chest Fever. He also contributed smoky piano and a cumulus falsetto that spilled over the edges of Rick Danko's lead part in This Wheels on Fire. I want to ask you about Richard's vocals and how important they were. You describe his importance to the weight and his improvised vocals. What he does with Dylan's lyrics on Tears of Rage is it's so powerful.
You're exactly right, and that's the part of the melodicism I've brought up multiple times. Richard had this innate ability, and that was one of the things I wanted to draw attention to, is to take whether he's interpreting someone else's song or one of the band's songs. He had this ability to like just add that little bit, whether it's something that's just falls between the cracks or it's something you're like, wow. And I feel like the weight is one of those things, when you layer those three vocals and then he comes in on the top and kind of just drizzles everything over the end, and then you hear the falsetto. It's there, but it's not. Like these are things that made the band special, and that's kind of what I wanted to draw attention to. Robbie Robertson wrote the song, beautiful song, but again, it goes to those little by everybody, those little contributions, and Richards were always from that musical space that just took things to another level. And you can hear it all over the Basement Tapes as well as Big Pink.
So unique. And the only way I can describe it would be to compare it to painting, and each of them brought their own distinct color. And you would think, boy, I don't know if you mix all these together, it might come up with this really odd looking color, but then you put them all together and it's this stunning vision of this color that you've never seen before that takes your breath away. It's just, I don't think there's ever been a band like before or since. I don't know, on paper, maybe you would look at it and say, I don't know, are these guys going to work? But,
Well,
man, did they ever work.
and they did, and to your point, perfect analogy with the painting. This has been talked about, but it bears repeating. Is you've got Robbie, who is arguably one of the greatest guitarists as well as being a completely adept songwriter. You got Levon, who's got the swamp in a groove that, like, and the southern slouch. He's got that, which gives them that swing. And then you got the blues influence, Richard. You've got the tobacco belt, high and lonesome holler from Rick. And then you're like, wow, what else do you need? And then you put in super genius Garth Hudson, who can put it all together, and just put this sheen or this rustic, whatever you require over the top of everything. And again, it was hard for me. One of the struggles was to write about Richard because as we've talked about, they're all so vitally important. But
Yeah.
Richard contributions, I think, were in danger of being lost, and that was part of the reason for this.
As for his songwriting, you say We Can Talk is his finest fully formed composition. Talk about how he structured the song around whoever sounded right singing it.
Yeah, and that's something too that that's been talked about with the band a lot. Robbie would say I'd write these songs for the characters I had in the group to sing these, but it's like you go to the first record and Richard contributed Lonesome Susie, We Can Talk, Tears of Rage, and he was in a station. He's writing these amazing songs, and again, it goes back to that kind of like selfless musical vibe he gave to everyone when he was collaborating. And first off, you can hear in those chord changes, Richard's piano style is recognizable. I feel like there's songs when you listen to later band songs, you could be like, oh, okay, that definitely came from a piano other than a guitar. Do you know what I mean? Just from the feel, you use certain
Sure.
rolls and certain kind of changes, like any musician, recognizable. With We Can Talk, it was one of those things. I feel like Richard's like, I can't be in front. I mean, this is a story. And Levon said in his biography, he was like, that is the way we actually talked. Richard captured that, like the bouncing back and forth. And it almost is like you're in the basement and you can see these guys. At least I can't. You can visualize the banter and the contributions. It's that same old riddle, only starting from the middle. Like stuff like these little couplets and these little,
Organic. Yeah.
yeah, you can just feel the organicness. You're
Yeah.
exactly right with that. It's one of the things I never could properly answer because he wrote words pretty well, whereas Robbie would deal in characters, Richard wrote from inside, I guess. If you were gonna, and that's why they made such excellent collaborators on the songs they worked on together. I feel like Richard, the theme that we can carry through this whole thing was selfless, no matter if it was with friends or if it was with music. And I think We Can Talk is a good representation of that kind of musical selflessness.
He probably would be uncomfortable to know that there was a book written about him. Right? I don't,
Totally.
I don't know why you're writing about me, but okay.
You're exactly right. And one of his good friends who knew him later in his life, he goes, I feel like Richard be extremely embarrassed, but he'd be super happy that
Yeah,
someone was pointing out his contributions.
sure.
And there's a story in there about that when Barney Hoskins' book was given to Richard. It said that Richard had done Share Your Love almost as good as Bobby Bland. And Richard's former manager, Joe Forno, said that Richard was just like walking 3 inches above the ground for 2 days after that. Just because, so he accepted it. He was just uncomfortable taking those
Right.
accolades.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. If you've just discovered the channel, thanks for joining us. If you've been watching all along, can't thank you enough for your support. Make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and also don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you get updates on latest episodes, video highlights, and more. Now back to the show. Couple more songs I want to ask you about. That we can't ignore.
Sure.
King Harvest Has Surely Come and I Shall Be Released. We cannot ignore those. King Harvest, you say, is a song that encapsulated what the band was all about. Talk about why you feel that way and Richard's contributions to this song.
I truly feel like every single element of the bigger machine is working at its optimal level right there. You've got the songwriting aspect, you've got the relationship of the drums and the bass. It's been talked about by Levon on one of the band classic albums, where it's got that woomph, like that move. So you got the
A
rhythm section,
groove to it.
yeah, and then you've got Garth just lay in the bed, shifty, making it move. And then you've got Richard's vocals, which are some of the most endearing and desperate at the same time in that song. And I feel like it accomplished everything that the band had set out to do by that second record. I believe Levon, I might use the quote in the book where he said, this was us. Like this is where we were like, yeah, we got this. I always feel like too that the lyric about the fairground on the edge of town, for me, I always go back to Stratford because that's when Ronnie saw Richard singing was at the fairgrounds in Stratford. And they're not related, but it's just one of those things, that
Sure.
things in my head and but I do feel, as I'm sure hardcore band fans feel the same way, like that's where it all like worked in perfect syncopation together.
And I Shall Be Released, Richard on piano and lead vocals, written by Dylan. Yet you write, quote, like everything he sang, the song became his.
Yeah, and still, even with Bob doing it and not so current times, but over the course of his career, I feel like, and even you listen to some of the Rolling Thunder stuff with Dylan, he dedicates it to Richard Manuel a couple nights. And I feel like when you listen to those basement tapes when it was in its formative stages, you can hear Dylan singing it, but Richard way up high with that high harmony. And you can feel where the band were gonna take it. And again, one of the Dylan's lyrics, like Tears of Rage, it's like Richard's voice almost gives those words more meaning. Because it's hard to understand. You can't just say, yes, this is what this song's about, like Richard said. And with I Shall Be Released, it's like, could you ask for anything more than that falsetto? And I'd love to trace, like I said, from the basement tapes to the finished product. It's one of those songs, in the basement, they gave some Dylan gave songs to Manfred Mann, Quinn the Eskimo. Some of these songs were given to other people. I Shall Be Released in Tears of Rage stayed home, stayed with the Hawks.
And things
Correct.
happened really fast in terms of the band becoming hugely popular. January of 70, they're on the cover of Time magazine. They're huge. And at this point, this is, I think, where we start to see the cracks. You write here, while Robbie Robertson seemed to meet the challenges and increased pressure with eagerness and creativity. Richard appeared to wilt under the scrutiny. So let's get into that now. We know about the frustrations with the rest of the guys and who gets song credit and publishing and all that. But Robbie said he begged Richard to write, and Richard said he was writing, but he didn't like being put on the spot. Could you talk about the relationship between Robbie and Richard? What was that like prior to the fame and the money coming in, and how did all that affect their relationship?
And see, it's strange because to your point, and I think you probably got this, I'm sure you did in the book. I tried to stay down the middle when it came to that songwriting stuff because there was a lot of
Every author's challenge writing these books, right? It's
yes,
so hard
and
not to get tangled up in that whole mess.
well, exactly. And the thing I always come back to is, and this, Levon didn't write songs. Levon was a master arranger, feel, band leader, everything. I can't say enough. Richard wrote songs. I mean, authored them on his own, and him and Robbie had a collaboration that Katie's Been Gone. I mean, would be enough, for like to mine that collaboration. I feel the relationship between the two of them, Robbie was a driven guy. They wouldn't have gotten anywhere really without his gumption and without his wanting to talk to managers and businessmen and newspapers like that.
And every group, every team needs that. And he
Yeah, and
was that guy.
he was that guy. And Levon was like, see, and I described this in the book. It was like Richard was a salve between two like alpha frictions. Do you know what I mean? Like these guys were both powerhouses, Levon and Robbie, and Richard just kind of did his thing. But the relation, I feel like, first off, you mentioned the pressure of fame. Some people can handle it, some cannot. Richard, going back to how he was and how he treated people, couldn't say no. And I think that damaged him more so than anything was once you get famous, and I'm paraphrasing, George Harrison says something along the lines like, there's people dusting you off and you're not even dirty. And I feel like Richard, that wasn't a positive thing for him. Not, and this is outside the band, but like not being able to say no, being given things, being treated a different way. And I feel like Robbie, as we just spoke about, was going this way, and Richard was kind of pulling back a little bit.
Right.
And I also
but
feel,
also his songwriting process was not one. Its songs would have to come naturally to Richard. He couldn't sit down and say, "Okay, the label wants a record. Let's get to work."
100%. And that's
Right.
the thing. And John Simon, the wonderful producer of the band's first two records, mentioned that before the second record, like we need 12 songs. And it's like that's not how Richard operated. And it's completely truthfully, he like you just said, he operated on inspiration. And it was easy to come in and have a song and then say, Richard, this is your part, sing this, or come up with a melody here on piano. But nothing was ever quite finished with Richard. And I think if you add in fame, pressure, and a problem with alcohol, it did not make for a good mixture at that point. But again, one of those narratives, he was still writing music. I just think he didn't have the confidence to present it to the group and to be vetted. He was no dummy. He knew that their big songs were sung by Levon and written by Robbie. He knew that. And it didn't upset him because he was such a team player. But I think it affected his confidence and shook him up a little bit.
And he self-medicated as far back as, I think, was he like 13 years old when he started drinking? Or what was the age?
He was nipping around with friends and they were taking stuff when he was a kid. It didn't really become a crutch until after that Time magazine. And I'm not saying that's the reason. I'm saying from stage fright on, it started to become, and I think it was to deal with obviously with self-confidence, to deal with the popularity, and to deal with the pressure of having to create under the spotlight as opposed to going into the basement of Ronnie Hawkins' club and creating. It didn't,
Yeah.
and it's a contrast I had trouble with, Eric, honestly, because he was such a showman in his early days, even while like rock star, small level, Stratford, party guy. And to see that diminish over the years, you have to attribute it to self-confidence. I don't think it's as easy to say this guy drank too much because there's a lot of musicians that drank too much. I really think that didn't help, but I also think that it was just it was a self-confidence in holding himself to this standard that wasn't there, really.
Did he have the same resentment that Levon had towards Robbie? What did he say about all of that in later years?
He
Because
never
didn't he
really,
want Robbie to produce his solo album? That's
yes,
in the book.
yes.
So he was still on pretty good terms with him.
Well, and it's weird because Robbie post band when he recorded like Between Trains for the soundtrack song Between Trains, and then he did the Best of Everything with Tom Petty. He would call Richard in to do these vocals. So Robbie knew. Yeah, I mean, like this is the best singer I ever worked with. Like he would still get Richard to come in there and contribute to these things. And Richard knew what they had. And I feel like they were both equally at fault for not nurturing that songwriting partnership. I really do. And I feel like once Robbie decided to not go back after the last waltz, and this is me coming up with this, I feel like he felt like he would be going back on what the pomp and circumstance of the last waltz was. Do you know what I mean? Like I can't go backwards. He had his own career in film, soundtracks, things of that nature. And right until the very end, and Richard, one of Richard's dear friends told me this, Richard held out hope. He wanted to collaborate with Robbie. He knew they had that
That
alchemy.
was heartbreaking to read.
Yeah.
That's what he was thinking right up until the end.
Yeah, and there's a quote in there that you probably saw that was part of the Woodstock interview that he did. On one of the tapes I had heard, the interviewer let it go, and this wasn't transcribed into that. And I'm paraphrasing, but Richard said, they asked about Robbie. He goes, I told him we can get a hotel room or something. We don't have to tell anybody. Just get together and write a couple songs. Yeah, and Richard laughed about it, but you could
Yeah.
tell that he really wanted that to happen. Those songs I mentioned, like Between Trains and especially the Petty song, it was still there. That magic was still there between those
It's a great
guys.
song. I'm a huge Petty fan. Love that song. But see, this book answers so much. It fills in a lot of the blanks. There's always that question: why did he do what he did on that night in 1986? March 6th, 1986. And I think this answers a lot of it. When the band comes to an end in 78, they reform in 83 without Robbie. So in between those handful of years, what's his life like at that point? Because it seemed like he was able to get clean and live a pretty low key life, and he was doing okay.
Yeah, like Richard said, pits and peaks, lots of pits and peaks. And really after the last waltz was the worst point. And as we talked about with the Revels, I think the loss of that brotherhood really stung Richard. He would still see those guys, but the greatest joy for him was creating music with his best friends, And he hit the bottle hard. His marriage was disintegrating with Jane. He had two kids that he loved dearly and tried to provide for. But when you're having trouble taking care of yourself, there was a lot of guilt there of being a good dad and also as the 80s dawned, not being in a position to take care of them how he thought he should. So when Arlie, who would be his second wife, Richard and Arlie moved back. They lived with the Hudsons for a while. Hudsons had a fire. Then they moved back to Woodstock, and Richard decided to get clean. And he moved into a duplex owned by Albert Grossman, who was a great advocate for Richard, over the years. And Gabe brought a piano from Bearsville, put it in the apartment so Richard could write songs. And Richard says, I'm going to quit drinking. And he did, and it almost killed him. His body
Really?
went into
Yeah.
shock.
Yeah. You're supposed to wean off of that when you're.
Yeah. And if you're somebody drinking like he drank at that point. So that really had a major, like what anybody, major effect on Richard. But he stuck to it and he did not drink and he was clean. Not of everything, but he was not abusing alcohol. And he went back and forth. So for those years, he was busy. He worked Bonnie Raitt on her album. He did a Willie Nelson track on one of Willie Nelson's albums. He did a soundtrack for the in documentary Kent State, added some piano there, did the Robbie stuff we talked about. So he was keeping busy. And this whole time he was trying to get something going. And there's a dated cassette of Richard from June of 1980 going into Bearsville and recording Breaking New Ground, which it was a co-write with Goffin and King. Song never came out, but Richard had these changes. He held on to that song like he knew he had it. He knew he had something special. And finally, later, a few years down the line, 85, he collaborated on words with Jerry Goffin on the phone and put this song together. So basically, by the time the band got together, reunited 83, 84, 85, he had collected a good amount of songs, many without words, but he was working, you
Yeah,
know?
because in the book, there's him talking about that. Like, I'm starting to feel like I'm enjoying myself again. Like I'm enjoying music. My creative spark is there again because it wasn't for a while.
And that's exactly it. And Richard was very candid in that Woodstock interview, which there's not many interviews with him, so it was good to mine, and I was glad I was able to listen to the whole thing. And he was very candid that the last waltz he wasn't in great shape, that he had problems, but he was working his way through them, just a very honest human interview. And that is really one of the sadder parts of the story is that he was looking for an avenue to get this stuff out of him.
Yeah, that's what made me surprised to hear about how things ended reading that because I thought, well, okay, he's doing good. And then he rejoins the band in 1983. It's without Robbie. And I'm thinking, well, maybe without the pressure from Robbie, maybe he's enjoying himself more. But he started feeling pressure again in 1984, according to the book.
Yeah, and he said I don't know exactly what these were, but he mentions opportunities that had passed them by. And what I think is telling is that, again, he had songs, and these are documented songs because he ended up playing them at solo shows. He had songs he was working on, and he didn't, when him and Rick did solo shows, he didn't play them. When the band went in to record an album in 85, he didn't present those originals. He did She Knows cover, which the band ended up releasing after Richard passed. Country Boy, like he would lean back on doing amazing versions of these songs as an interpreter. But I always wondered, and it always brings me back full circle to like he just didn't have. He needed that collaborator or someone to say, "These are great songs. Do you want me to add words to these? What can we do for this?" And I truly believe that Eric Clapton would have been that guy for him.
Yeah, you quote him in the book. Some
Yeah,
very insightful comments from Clapton.
he really loved Richard. He really loved Richard
He
and
could relate to Richard's struggles.
parallel paths,
Yeah,
really. And the only difference was Eric made it. I
right.
mean, it was so close. And I think that they were going to try to get something together later on. But I mean, and the thing that if Richard could have held on, everything that they were doing, whether it was Levon and Rick or Rick and Richard, the living room shows, or the barn later on down the line,
Yeah.
or, on MTV Unplugged, he would have flourished in that.
And the music that they made, the albums they put out post Robbie days, some really good stuff on there.
Exactly. And can you
Really
imagine
good
if
stuff.
Richard had the confidence to give some originals? They wouldn't have to
Yeah.
outsource those writers. And no disrespect to any of those writers. Those are some great songs, and they mind Dylan and Jules Shear and great songs. But I mean, if he could have just held on, the '80s were hard on a lot of those guys and girls. And if he would have held on and come around, I feel like he would have flourished. It was just like a few years.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, plus a video highlight and a link to our YouTube channel. Links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. You mentioned he was struggling with his place as a father. He kind of felt like because he couldn't take care of himself, he was questioning himself as a father. So I feel like that had a lot to do with that decision he made on that night in 1986. But also he was bummed that they were playing smaller venues, right? That was he wasn't happy about that. That was kind of like, why did we put? It's shocking for us as fans to even think about that. I know Robbie wasn't there, but they were playing some pretty small places, weren't they?
Yeah, and to your point, Eric, part of it was he had he had paid his dues.
Yeah,
Like
now he's going back to having to play those places.
that's and again, we go back to the self-confidence and the issues that he had personally about his music. And you work 20 years to get to this point. You're playing, I'm just using this as you're playing Wembley Stadium, on a beautiful grand piano, and now all of a sudden you're playing the Cheek to Cheek Lounge on a keyboard that doesn't work, that's sometimes supplied by the venue. And it's like, I mean, it's a hit. It's hard enough
Yeah,
to stay up, and then to have crappy equipment, crappy venues, people sliding drinks, buy the piano player a drink. It was a recipe for disaster. And then, as you said, with the guilt, a divorce, addiction, you take it all together, and it was too much for a sensitive.
and the quote he said, boy, that's haunting. It was right at the front of the book. If I take another drink again, I'm done. Like he
Yeah,
put that much pressure on himself just for that. Like
yeah,
if I get back on that bottle again, man, I'm done. My life's done. I'm over. Basically saying I'm gonna take my life. I mean, I
yeah.
think that's what really what happened. March 6th of 1986, and you mentioned Cheek to Cheek Lounge. That's where he was playing in Winter Park, Florida, on that night. And there's a story that Levon has told that Richard went to his room after the show and seemed to be in quote unquote decent spirits. That's Levon's limited explanation or description of his mood that night. What happened after he leaves Levon's room?
When he went back, Arlie, his wife, was there in the room, and she said that Richard was agitated. And I think earlier in the day he'd been agitated, where he made the comment where he says, "I'm never gonna effing play the shape I'm in again." And I think it was all coming to a head. And what we neglected to mention is Albert Grossman had passed away. So I feel like he had lost another advocate, another father figure. I think that venue, and one of the things I thought was very telling was there was a newspaper article where somebody saw Richard after the show that night and said, are we gonna get a new album?" And Richard pretty much said, I don't know. I don't know. A few weeks before, a month or two ago, or before that, he was like, oh, he was talking to a Stratford paper or something. He's like, we got a new album in the can. You're going to get new band music. So something shook free there where he had lost hope in that, where he had lost hope in himself. I mean, obviously, that's exactly what happened. Is he finally lost hope in himself, which is, where do you go from there at that point?
Yeah, he had his wife there. In fact, they both fell asleep.
Yeah.
And he got up, went into the bathroom, took the belt off, and it's just terrible to think what was going through his mind at that point. And the danger was leaving him alone,
Yeah.
right? That was the
Yeah.
thing. You leave him alone to his thoughts. That was from like early childhood days. They would say that too. You leave him
Right.
alone with his
Exactly.
thoughts, then the dark thoughts start to come in and take over.
Yeah, and I think we've dug into that, and that was very insightful, as you're talking about in the early stuff and when he was on the road and writing home to his mom. Like,
Yes,
Richard needed that environment of nurturing. Again, I feel like that's when he was at his greatest, and when he felt or had those moments, like anybody, to dwell on the things that weren't working in his life, it overtook him. Levon has said it a number of times. Richard was the kind of guy who felt things more deeply than anybody that he ever knew. And I just think that night there was a lot that came down hard on him.
which is why his vocals were so beautiful and powerful because it was all coming out.
Yeah,
It's everything that was inside him coming out. He was just 42 years old.
yeah.
What an amazing body of work he leaves behind. What do you hope people will remember most about Richard Manuel? What do you hope people will get out of this book?
Well, first, that the band, obviously, as we've talked about, were such an important part of rock music at a large scale. And I tried to explain that aspect of them, maybe not as much as like popular fame, but they're contemporaries. George Harrison, Eric Clapton, Roger Waters. These guys all changed what they were doing because of the band. You look at music from Big Pink, and you look at what came after it, psychedelia went out the window. Now you got the White Album, Beggar's Banquet,
That
things.
always fascinated me. Roger Waters saying that of
Yeah,
Pink Floyd.
yeah. Richard Thompson, so many guys. Like this album, well, Big Pink was so vital, and then I mean, everything they did. But Richard's part in that I felt was in danger of getting lost. And I really just wanted to focus in a meaningful way on his contributions. I just felt because of all the reasons we've talked about tonight of why Richard struggled with self-confidence and his addictions and things of that nature, I really wanted to say, hey, there's a lot more to this guy. If you feel the band is one of the most vital and important things to happen in the history of rock, then you gotta point to this guy. You have to talk about him. And I really hope that people, not just his voice, but killer drummer, killer slide guitar
Right, we
player.
didn't even talk about
We
that.
didn't even talk about the drumming. And that's the thing, when Levon left, Richard jumped on the kit. And it was one of those things where like we didn't even know he played drums. His friends in Stratford are like, yeah, he'd bang around a little bit, but like all of a sudden we're like, oh my God, Richard's a drummer and a great one.
Which tells you he could have done an entire album on his own if he wanted.
And yeah, and that's kind of what we were talking about, if he had made it past that certain point, that was the lo-fi en vogue home studio stuff, and he was doing had the ability to do that. I just hope the focus on his musical accomplishments and like I said, you have to talk about certain things, but I feel like by trying to distill it down to just what his contributions were and what were great about his abilities and his musicality, I hope people get a different picture of Richard. And I think he gets, for lack of a better term, some respect on his name, going forward.
Richard Manuel, his life and music from the Hawks and Bob Dylan to the band. It is coming out on June 17th, but people can pre-order this through schifferbooks.com,
Yeah, and it's also up for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes and
Amazon,
Noble. They're
Barnes and
pretty,
Noble.
yep, brick and mortar. You can go to my website too if you want to hear about events or any press that's coming out for the book. I kind of put a repository there on my website.
Which
All the
is
talkfromtherockroom.com.
talkfromtherockroom.com. So that's really the best place to go if people want to reach you, contact you.
Yes, and
Just
I
go to
love
the
to talk
website.
about Richard or any kind of music. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I could talk to you all night about Richard Manuel. So I really appreciate you spending the time to talk to me about this book. It's fantastic. Congratulations. And the band, fans of the band, like I have a friend of mine who's a huge fan of the band, and he already knew this book was coming out months ago. He had heard about it. And I said, let me see if I can get him on, man. I'm going to try.
Oh, thank you so
And
much.
here you
Seriously,
are.
I love talking about it anytime. Seriously, it's like now that it's actually happening, it's just a relief to be able to share this stuff and talk about Richard. I love it.
And boy, wouldn't it be great to have a book on Danko and Garth and because we've gotten books on Levon, we got a book on Robbie.
Yep, yep. It would be
So
nice to get these guys all their due. They all
yeah,
got fantastic stories.
Stephen Lewis, thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.